Cold War was a struggle in 1947 for political, economic, and ideological power between the two superiors of the world, the United States and the Soviet Union. Before the World War II, Western leaders and the Marxist regime in Russia couldn't stand each other. The Americans hated Marxism, while the Marxists hated Western capitalism. But the West and the USSR put their differences aside and allied together during the Second World War to defeat their common enemy, Nazi Germany. After winning against their fascist rival in 1945, the Americans and the Soviets went back to hating each other at the cost of their alliance. Tension between the two countries built up as the Soviets increased their control over Poland, upsetting the Americans, British, and the French. As a result, the Americans retaliated by ending the Lend-Lease aid to the USSR. Another thing that was subject to much controversy was deciding what to do with occupied Germany. The Soviets wanted Germany's industrial infrastructure to compensate for the extensive damage done by the Germans. But the West refused because they thought the Soviets were going to use this to plot a communist takeover. The Soviet Union, being the superpower that it is, began taking in formerly independent countries into its union, such as Estonia and Latvia, while at the same time buffing up its control over Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the very countries the US wanted to free. Stalin then presented a speech in February 1946 denouncing capitalism. As a result, the Iron Curtain was declared in March 1946 by the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Iron Curtain was an attempt for the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from the open contact with the West and the non-Soviet controlled areas.
In 1947, the British announced that they could no longer afford to support the pro-Western governments of the Mediterranean in their fight against communism. If the U.S. could not take up the burden, the whole region was in danger of falling under communist rule. The Truman administration responded decisively. On March 12, 1947, the president went before a joint session of Congress to request aid for the countries of Greece and Turkey.
The Truman Doctrine was an idea where the U.S. would give support to anyone threatened by the Soviet forces or communist insurrection. The communists saw this as an open declaration of war, and so the Cold War began. To the Marshall Plan, a plan to offer American aid to the demolished countries in Europe. The plan was important in rebuilding the devastated economies of Western Europe. Stalin denounced the Marshall Plan as a way for the US to gain economic power over Europe, and retaliated by creating the Communist Information Bureau that served to bring the global communist movement under Moscow's control and turn the movement against the West. February 1948, the communists initiated a coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia to replace the coalition government with one subservient to Moscow. The West were angered by this and began creating a military alliance and signaled its intention to form an independent West German state. Stalin then retaliated by making the Berlin blockade, cutting off Western access. May 1949, Stalin called off the blockade, but by that time, the West established a German state and a military alliance aimed against the USSR. The alliance came to be known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Stalin then responded by establishing an East German state and an opposing military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, and so the Cold War became global.
1955, Nikita Khrushchev became Stalin's successor in the USSR and advocated for the peaceful coexistence, whereby the East and West continue their competition but in a less confrontational manner. The USSR and US rivaled in arms race, amassing arsenals of destructive weapons. 1960 and onwards, the realization of the growing danger of the arms race resulted in a series of nuclear arms agreements. This realization came to light by the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the US backed an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro. The failed invasion prompted Fidel Castro, a Marxist Cuban revolutionary, to side with the Soviets. 18 months later, after discovering that the USSR was placing missiles in Cuba, President J.F. Kennedy issued an ultimatum to Khrushchev to remove the missiles or face the consequences.
Regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Since Khrushchev was not ready for war, the Soviets removed their missiles and a nuclear war was averted. 1970, the policy of détente appeared to offer a possible end to the Cold War, but was unlikely to happen at the time. The US was engaged in Vietnam, fighting what it believed to be a Moscow-inspired attempt to spread communism. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had recently brutally repressed Czechoslovakia's attempt to achieve socialism. This was in line with the Brezhnev Doctrine, whereby the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev claimed the right to intervene in any socialist country in order to preserve socialism. Nevertheless, the US and the USSR tried to relax tensions by finding common ground on a number of mutual interests. This included the 1972 Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, which put limitations on the number of weapons the US and the USSR could produce. In 1975, 35 nations, including the US and the USSR, signed the Helsinki Agreement. Despite agreeing to the Helsinki to respect human rights, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 and crushed the independent trade union Solidarity in Poland in 1981, the détente was finished. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union and the Cold War began to wind down. Gorbachev initiated a policy of reform due to economic problems. When the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991, the Cold War was over.